Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet today and recognize that this land has always been under their custodianship. I am on the land of the Yakara, Yugra, and Yugara Pool people. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. I invite you to write down in the chat room the country you are on, and I would like to pay my respect to elders past and present. Claire Saxby, we welcome her as part of the Australia Reads campaign, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that. Australia Reads is a unique Australian book industry collaboration between authors, booksellers, libraries and publishers, born of a common passion for and mutual interest in championing reading, promoting the many mental health and lifestyle benefits of reading books, and encouraging the next generation of avid book readers to significantly increase book reading by all Australians, no matter the format they read. And I know that a few of our Right Links members are also Australia Reads ambassadors. So welcome to those as well. So now I'm going to introduce Claire. Claire Saxby writes award-winning fiction, non-fiction and poetry for young people. Her work is published in Australia and internationally. Recent books include Haywire, which is a historical novel, Kookaburra with Tanya Harricks, Aussie STEM stars Georgia Ward-Fear, a biography, Iceberg illustrated with Jess Reich-Lafitte, and I see it in the background there, I think, Claire. Treasure with Tutul Suwanakit, and Great White Shark with Cindy Lane. I'm going to leave it up now to Claire to introduce herself further, and thank you very much for being here. Let's give her a warm clap. Well, this is our clap. This is our warm welcome.
Thank you, Yvonne, and welcome to everybody. Can I just see some thumbs up if you can hear me clearly and you can see me clearly? Excellent. I'm coming to you from the land of the Yalukit Willam people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land I write my stories. Today, I think we gave the title of this The Long and the Short of It, and the subtitle talked about poetry, picture book and novels. What I'm going to focus on today, because this is what you were looking for, is narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is a very broad brush. And so I will take you through a bit of my history, and then a bit of the history of a particular narrative nonfiction title that I've written, but referencing a number of other different ways to tell stories along the way. If that sounds okay, I'd like to see some more thumbs up. Actually, that's a really bad thing to do, because if you don't want to hear that, I don't want to see any thumbs down. So take that back. That's what you're getting. All right. So what I thought I would do initially, rather than give you a dictionary definition of what narrative nonfiction is, was just very briefly talk about what it is for me, and then share one of my stories, which is narrative nonfiction. So narrative nonfiction for me basically means that I do a lot of research and I find out as many true things as I can, but then I write a story which may be connecting the dots between information, or may just have that information sitting on my shoulder while I write narrative. And narrative nonfiction can be all of those things. And I'll show you a few more details of some of the books that I've done in a bit. But first of all, it's story time. So hopefully I can still share my screen. Let's see what happens. And I'm going to introduce you to Iceberg. Iceberg is written by me and illustrated by Jess Reich-Lafitte and published by Allen and Unwin. Here we go. Now I need thumbs up if you can see some icebergs. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to read from this book, but I will show you the images on your screens. Bit easier to see. But how good are those end papers? Every one of those icebergs has a name, and at one point we were going to name them, but we went back for the narrative part of narrative nonfiction rather than the nonfiction part of narrative nonfiction. This book is dedicated to the scientists and the photographers who bring the Antarctic in all its wonder to us here. In the final freeze of an Antarctic winter, green tails wave across a starful sky as if to end farewell endless nights. If this world looks empty, look closer. Those are penguin tracks, and beneath the ice, orca roam. In the pale morning, an iceberg calves, shears from a glacier and plunges to the ocean in a haze of sparkle frost. The iceberg is flat-topped, sharp and angular, and carries ancient weather in its layers of ice clothing, a coat for each year volcanoes blew, and black ash fell like snow. If this world looks empty, look closer. Birds are coming. They know about Antarctic summers. The new iceberg bobs in the water, an unfettered island, its mountain hidden underneath. Waves ripple away, oh, to quiver at the pack ice. Cracks unshackle algae suspended all winter, and under ice krill stir. They know summer is near. Leopard seals lurk as a raft of penguins explode like black and white rockets from an ice hole. Fish fat and sleek, the emperor's belly slap, begin the inland trek to feed hungry chicks. Adelie penguin parents take turns to perch as meltwater trickles past their rock nests. Summer arrives. Sun sparkles on a murk green sea. Clouds of krill swim shallow and deep, feed and grow. Days stretch and nights shrink until the sun just taps at the horizon. Fish hunt salps. Terns wheel overhead. Blue-eyed cormorants too, their wingspans wider than outstretched arms. Humpback whales spiral, filter krill from giant mouthfuls of sea. Penguins dive deep for fish. Seals dive deeper to twitch whisker hunt. Squid chase krill. Birds chase squid. Orca gather, linger, watch and seize. Short-tailed shearwaters feast, then return to their chicks. Now this wordless page is a bit hard to see just on a sheet, but I'll try and show you a bit more. It's the most glorious spread with so many fantastic animals in it. The iceberg drifts where the currents push, where the winds blow. Summer sun softens edges. Undersea currents wash at the hidden mountain. Autumn brings shorter days. The sea cools. Visitors depart to the deep, to warmer islands, to tropical birthing waters, to faraway summers. Seals cluster around holes until they too close. Loose frazzle crystals extend and join. Flip-edge pancakes jostle and raft. Rafts become flows. Sea ice thickens. Krill retreat to Underberg hollows to wait out winter. This iceberg, every iceberg, is winter-bound, ice-bound, sea-bound, stuck. Sometimes rain falls, but mostly the sky swirls snow or ice crystals in this frozen desert. Winter tides swell and ebb. Nights fall and fade. Storm winds rage down inland mountains, mound long snow furrows, and only fade when they find the sea. It may seem that winter will never end when the sun fails to breach the horizon, and even aurora trails only sometimes appear. Just wait. Spring returns. Waves lap, lap, lap the iceberg until it looks velvet soft. Currents drag, winds push, the iceberg twists, tilts, rocks, shears. It is old now, small and tall and small and mellow. It eddies into a sheltered bay, tips and falls. This world is not empty, nor ever still. Far from the places we know, it feels everything we do. Ocean, sky, snow and ice, minute greens and giant blues dance a delicate dance. In another pale Antarctic dawn, an iceberg calves, settles to the sea. And that is the end of the story. Thank you. So, having read you the story, I'm going to take you backwards to where I began and then to where this story began. So I am going to share screen again and show you absolute mastery of technology. Thumbs up from somebody if that's looking like it should look. Excellent. So, the long and the short of it, a story of poetry, picture books, and even a novel or two. I started writing about 25 years ago. And the first picture book I wrote convinced me that all the hard work was done, that I would, from here on, just go on to become wealthy, famous, acclaimed, that it would be really difficult to go shopping, even to get my toothpaste and to get my potatoes, because too many people would know me. You might notice that there's a clip holding that picture book together, and that's because these are final proofs, and the company went broke. And it took me 6 years to get another picture book. These 3 picture books, the first one, Ebby's Boat, is a story about disguise, but it's a story about my son and how he was different to all my other children and how that was a wonderful thing and should be celebrated. I spent some time on a farm as a younger person, and so my next couple of picture books featured animals. There Was an Old Sailor was the first book I had that made it onto a CBCA notables list, which was very exciting. And I was in the middle of a PD session for my community health job when the news came through, and it was really hard to sit and listen to ways to continue my health practice when what I really wanted to do was go home and write some more books. More books followed. These books are about children doing what children need to do, which is unplanned activity, even more important now than it ever was, about dogs that like to roll in smelly things, including dead fish, inspired by my dog that once had to be washed 3 times in one day before we just closed the door and left her outside. Stories come from everywhere. Wild Park came from a a radio conversation where a new grandfather was saying, why do they keep showing grandfathers only in fawn cardigans with 3 hairs? I'm a black-haired, hairy, handsome pa. And I took that phrase and I kept it for probably 5 or 6 years before it became the story that is Wild Pa. I took some Christmas songs and made them into stories, one set on a farm, one set on a beach, and one set in an urban environment. I've written some non-fiction stories. These stories, The Anzacs and Weary Dunlop, are both straight non-fiction. Everything in there is taken from multiple sources and distilled down for young readers. The Anzac Billy, in contrast, was based on a 3-line piece in a 1914 newspaper from Warrnambool, which is down in the southwest of Victoria. And I found it when I was researching the Anzacs, and I didn't have time to explore it, so I put it away. So based on those 3 lines, I built the story of a young boy who is missing his father. But it's also about the truth of the Billy that he's carrying that was one of 60,000, I think, Billies that were sent across to the First World War at the end of 1915. It is the only time in history that Billies were filled with treats and sent across to the war. But it began an ongoing tradition of sending treats to our servicemen in active service in other countries. My Name is Lizzie Flynn is also a narrative nonfiction story in that it's based on a quilt. It's based on a quilt that was made by young convict women coming out to Australia in 1841. And I took the youngest convict aboard that ship, who was 13. I borrowed her first name and her last name from 2 other young convict people. So I had the crime from one, the sentence from another, the first name from a third, and a surname from the fourth. So each element of this is true in the sense that it's a conglomerate of information all put together, but it is a fictional story about a real happening, a real event, the making of this quilt on a journey from England to Australia. There was no diary kept that provides any information about their daily life. So I've had to glean things from the surgeon's report, all sorts of things, all sorts of sources. And when this book was going to print, so completely finished, research, checked all of these things, 2 academics in Tasmania brought out a fat tome which included every little piece of information I needed to write this story, only 2 years too late. However, it was really positive for me to go back to this book brought out by these 2 academics and feel that nothing that they were saying made lie of the story that I'd written. It was very affirming. Bird to Bird begins with a seed dropped in a forest in England and ends with a bird carved and set to fly in a tree in a more metaphorical sense. But in between, it follows that seed becoming a tree and looks at that tree being chopped down and taken into an industrial London and being used to make bunking for convicts to come to Australia, and then it has an ongoing life. I came to this story through a librarian who told me that on the eve of his wedding, his mother-in-law asked him to knock down this unsightly cabin on their property where the wedding was going to be set. And he found there this piece of timber that had come from the ship that it had those convicts, and it had a whole life in between. So I took all of these little pieces of facts and I joined them together in a narrative to make a story that is essentially true and sits on that continuum of between fiction and nonfiction that I would call narrative nonfiction. Then I started writing these nature storybooks. Now these do this. They have two strands in them, these stories. The first is a narrative nonfiction about a story about an individual animal. It is still a story. It has a beginning, a middle, a climax, an ending. It has a character. But on every page also is nonfiction information that connects to the species. So they sit side by side. They can be read together or they can be read separately. And I have discovered that this is a form that I really enjoy. It also means I get to use quite a lot of my research in either one or other of it, of the texts that are on the page. And it means that also when I go and share these books with young readers, I get to share some of the information that just doesn't fit in the story, that won't fit. And I don't begin to write these stories until I have discovered some information that is very little known by the most people, if that makes sense. More of these nature storybooks followed. And as Yvonne mentioned, I've also written a biography of a wildlife scientist who is also an adventurer and has inspired me to write stories about some of the animals that she encountered in the course of her research. I've learned more than I ever need to know about cane toads. I will never write about cane toads because they don't need any more time in the press. But her work is largely about trying to save some of our Australian animals from the relentless march of the cane toad. Sometimes stories come from all sorts of places, and this is not a narrative nonfiction story in any way. This is the story of what happens when you find a bag of pirates on your lawn. Totally ridiculous, rhyming for very young children. Tal Sawanakit's work is amazing, and he's really ramped up the comedy in this story, and it's just such fun to see what he makes of my words. Now, to me, the story began with a spell check craziness, and again, I kept that set phrase for a number of years before it became a story, but it's very exciting to actually see it become a story. Haywire is a novel that refused to fit in a picture book context. It is the story of the Danira. That was a shipload of mostly German internees that arrived in Australia in the early days of World War II. Because my experience was in picture books, that was my comfort zone, and that's how I would like to have written this story if I could have made it work. I couldn't. So I decided I needed to do it in a long form story. It is a novel for upper primary readers. I wrote it and rewrote it and walked away from it many, many times. And it took more than 6 years from idea to the book that you see there. Great White Shark is another nature storybook. And although technically great white sharks are not just Australian, as the other animals in this series are, Australia is one of the places where great white sharks are consistently seen. And they are truly amazing. I don't even consider any of the topics in this series unless I am totally enamored of the animal, wanting to know more. And great white sharks get a lot of bad press. And I wanted to produce something that showed some of their majesty, some of their beauty, and hopefully offset some of the bad press they get with the information about how fabulous they are. I work in a bookshop, and Great White Shark is currently face out in our closed door bookshop. And it's fantastic to see young children going past going, whoa, Great White Shark, I need that book. It's a wonderful thing to think that children are so hungry for information and so hungry for subjects that are presented in a way that, you know, is set up for them. But today, what I'm mostly going to focus on is the process behind Iceberg. So I came to Iceberg because of the language of ice, the language of the polar regions, and specifically the Antarctic. When my middle son was about 9 or 10, he had an assignment to do and he was sick. So my other 2 children were at school, and I was able to take just him down to the library, and we pulled out a whole stack of books about the Antarctic ecosystem. And while he was sort of getting information, I was being seduced by the words in these books. You know, words for ice, like pancake ice and grease ice, which on one level gives you this picture of something that, you know, like an oil spill, but it's not. It's just that really thin film of ice that just gives you this different reflective nature of light. You know, to have an iceberg described as a cheeky growler just gave it such personality. And then the notion of an old grandfather blue, even just the fact of the shape of the words, it gave me this feeling that connected to these old, worn, sometimes turned upside down icebergs. Ice flowers, you know, just the notion of ice flowers sitting on water, and they do just sit like these spicules coming off the sea. And the language of glaciers with shears and calves and all these fantastic words. They were my introduction to this world. And I wrote a poem which was published by the school magazine. And then about 10 years later, I came back to that poem and I looked at it and I realised that, you know, there were things that I juxtaposed that all belonged in that world, but the timing was wrong. So I started to look more at the world of the iceberg. All of the shapes have different names that, you know, apart from being totally stunning, the fact that they are described in lots of different ways just fascinated me. I spent a lot of time on the Antarctic government, Australian government's Antarctic website, travelling with these scientists, if you like, learning about all the fantastic things that they did and that they brought, discoveries that they made and things that they brought to us. And then it really started to come to life for me. The photographs, Paul Nicklin is a photographer and he works mostly in the poles. He's a Canadian. He does a lot of work in the Arctic, but in recent years, he's done quite a lot of work in the Antarctic as well. And his images are just unbelievable, but in addition to how fabulous they are, he includes information. Like this trail of bubbles behind, this is air being shed by the emperor penguin so that it can exit the water fast. And that's just not about playing games. That's because below the water, leopard seals know that this is where the penguins exit the water. And unless they go quickly and in groups, the leopard seal is going to get lunch and perhaps dinner and more. And so suddenly I started to get this idea about story connected into this research that I was doing. And then, of course, when I started to think about it, of course, we know that the Antarctic has all sunlight one time of year and no sunlight at the other time of the year. And that's great to know that. But if you're going to put animals into this landscape, when the amount of sun and temperatures are so important, then you need to know when and where they are. The one thing that's immutable is it's cold down there. It's really cold. Back to the ecosystem that I totally ignored when my son was doing his assignment, because it wasn't something I was interested in at the time. But this is no food chain. Food chain is simple. It's linear. This is not. And I became, I was diving into all of this. I still at this point had no idea how I was going to tell the story, but I knew that I wanted to and that I needed more information. I needed to know who was a resident, who was a visitor, who was coming here from the other side of the world. Blue whales traverse every ocean except the Arctic Ocean. There was just so much information and my head was spinning, and this is the big things. And then I started looking at the little things that actually kick off this process. Things like, we're familiar with krill perhaps, but things like sea star larvae and tiny crustaceans. And then I discovered these electron microscope pictures of really, really tiny things. And I was in serious danger of getting lost in wanting to be an artist to create these fantastic shapes. Look at this. It is so fabulous and so tiny, but it's not a story. I discovered salps that I had never heard of before and am seriously in love with now. These are tiny little creatures. They reproduce by cloning at one point in their life. So when the waters start to warm up a little bit, we get this massive reproduction of salps by cloning. And then they are all female. The females break off, reproduce sexually, become male, and then reproduce, and then, they're doing the other part of the equation. It's just like mind-boggling how fabulous these things are that I had never heard of, and I thought I understood. I needed to also think about the fact that all the things that were happening at different times, like what happened in summer and what happened in autumn, and who did, when were the eggs being laid? When were the chicks leaving home? And this was all getting totally overwhelming. So I had to do myself a spreadsheet. So this spreadsheet includes not all of the information that I had, but a lot of it, so that I could work out in my head when things were happening and when events were interacting, when stuff happened, basically just when stuff happened. So I had maps of the Antarctic. I had books, lots of information about when birds came. There are birds that nest in the south of Tasmania and then fly to the Antarctic, taking a 4-day trip to find food to bring back 4 days back to feed their chicks in their nest. This is such a complex ecosystem. And then I needed all of this before I could begin to write my story. So it wasn't really until this point that I started to work out what story I wanted to write about. And that cues for me, I'm handing over to you for a minute, and it is literally a minute, to write down what you want to write about. And I'm going to give you 2 goes at this. The first one is a single minute, and I will time you. And then I will give you another opportunity to write about it. So hopefully being writers and illustrators, you have got something to write on and something to write with. So now I'm going to time 1 minute of a free writing exercise. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the idea of free writing. Free writing involves no editing, no stopping, no crossing out, and it is purely for you. This first exercise is just about making the connection between you and a writing implement. My suggestion to you would be to make that a pen or pencil, but if you only ever write on a screen, then by all means, have a go at doing it that way. But for me, I find there is something about the connection between a pencil and a paper that brings ideas onto page much better than doing it initially onto screen. So thumbs up, somebody, if you are ready. Yes, excellent. Here comes the timer. 1 minute and go. Five seconds. 3, 2, stop. Okay. So ideas are just part of starting a story. With nonfiction, there's all the research that we talked about, but it always has to begin with an idea. And I'm a very firm believer in carrying a notebook with you wherever you go. Now, some people will use a phone. I still find that it's quicker, and for me, makes more. It's better for me to write it on in a book. Notebooks are messy, incomplete, but they allow you to continue the conversation that you might be having when an idea happens, because people get upset when you tune out and start writing stories when you're in the middle of a conversation with them. Reasonable enough. When I've transcribed an idea onto the computer, I will then cross the page out or fold it down so that the next time I need to, see it, all these pages are all, so that the next time I have an idea, it's quick to go to a new page. I tend also, and everybody is different, I tend to write on only one side of the page. And I do that even after I've started working more seriously on a project. I will get a folder like this. I will put some idea of what it's about on the front, and I will tend to write on one side of the page. And the reason I do that is because when I go back to those notes, sometimes reading those notes will give me will cue a question in my head, and I can put an arrow across the page and fill in that detail that I haven't left room for in the first page. Okay, so now I'd like you to have another go at that exercise, because this time, instead of doing 1 minute, I'd like you to do 3 minutes. And the idea is the same. What is it that you want to write about? Don't need complete sentences. Sometimes you won't know what you want to write about, or not completely, until you start writing something down. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes now to answer the same question. You can look at what you did in the first one and continue to write, or you can start again completely You can write about something that you were already starting to think about and try and think about the angle that you're going to take with it and the sort of information that you might want to know. Or you can do it about something that your plot problem that you've got. It doesn't matter what it is. Just keep writing. Don't run out. Don't edit. Don't cross out, and don't stop. And your 3 minutes begins now. One minute left. Ten seconds. Okay, pens down. I feel like a school teacher. Okay. The longer you write, the more your story will reveal itself. It may not be completely, and you may start off writing, this is a stupid exercise, I don't know what to write, why would I even begin? But I find that even if that is how I start, and sometimes it is how I start, I find that eventually I start getting to the maybe and what if and perhaps I could, and then I start being able to explore what I want to do with that story. So the next thing that you need to do is build an idea into a story. You've got all this research, it's sitting on your shoulder. It doesn't tell the story, but it is a starting place. And one way I have of trying to build a story from an idea is to triangulate it. And so my idea, if you imagine, idea is this blue triangle. And you need to think about, even with a narrative nonfiction story, you need to think about the three basic elements of story. The first is the character or characters. If you're writing a picture book, mostly there is a single main character, a viewpoint character, and it's the same with narrative nonfiction. You need to consider the setting. You need to consider the setting in terms of place, with lots and lots of sensory elements to it, but also in time. The same story will be completely different depending on the time in which you tell it. And then, of course, the other thing that you need is a plot or a problem or a premise, an idea. Why is this? Why are you telling this story? What is this? What are the stakes for this story? When I wrote Big Red Kangaroo, I had to work out the extent of the story as well. So for my Big Red Kangaroo, the story takes place between dusk and dawn. And the stakes are increased by Big Red is looking after his family, and it always he has to be aware of other young male kangaroos wanting to take his place. So you have the plot, the problem, and the duration in this case is a single evening, single night. When I wrote Emu, one of the things I discovered was that emus sit on their nest for 8 weeks, virtually not eating or drinking the entire time they're sitting on eggs. But that wasn't enough for a story. I needed to extend it beforehand to the courtship with the female, who then lays the eggs and then buggers off and is never seen again. And I wanted to give my emu some reward for all of this work by seeing his chicks make it to adulthood. And I wanted to explore some of the difficulties that an emu has in making sure that that happens, some of the predators, some of the problems for the eggs and the young chicks. So this story takes place where from its duration is from when a young male emu is got a bit of a twinkle in his eye to when his offspring are ready and prepared to leave their nest and become independent. Koala is such an iconic animal. It was a really tricky thing to find a point of tension and a way to tell this story. And I discovered during the research, I discovered that koalas, when they become pregnant again, they will literally close the pouch to the young koala, and the young koala then has to go and find his own way. And so that's the beginning of my story. My koala gets tossed out of the nest and has to find a home. So the plot problem for that becomes, will this koala find a home? That is the story question. Will this koala find a home? And the duration is the time it takes him to find that, and that's around a month. With Dingo, I took it back to a single night, actually less than a single night. The whole action in this story takes place over about 3 or 4 hours from dusk in winter into the sort of the middle of the evening. Kookaburra have very strong family connections, and so it wasn't possible to tell the story of an individual kookaburra without bringing in the entire family. So this story takes place as a new season approaches, and there will be eggs, and those eggs will hatch, but it begins as the family does the preparation for a new clutch of eggs, and it ends before the eggs hatch. Great white sharks, they roam the ocean. They cover enormous distances. To show any single snapshot of a shark, would be to show only a very small portion of the story. And I wanted to tell a much bigger story than that. So this story takes place over probably 6 to 9 months as the great white shark travels in the ocean and eventually gives birth to some pups. Iceberg is the story of the birth, life and death of an iceberg. It is 12 months in Antarctica. So choosing the extent of your story is a really important element along your story journey. So now what I'd like you to do, and I'll give you 2 minutes to do this one, is I want you to think about either a work in progress or a new story or a new idea, perhaps something that you wrote about in one of those first exercises, perhaps something you already know about, and think about the extent that you would like to make this story. Think about the plot. Think about if you've got your character, think about the setting and think about the plot problem. If you have a fantastic plot, think about the characters that will people it and make it work. If you have an amazing setting, then think about the character that you will put into that place. This is exactly the same as you would do for a fiction story. It's really important that you do it for a narrative nonfiction one as well. All right, 2 minutes. And your times. Please forgive the cold callers who are calling on my phone. They will go away in a minute. Your time starts now. 30 seconds left. Ten. Okay, stop. Doing these writing exercises may not answer all the questions. It may just present new questions to you, and that's okay because it gives you direction. One of the things you need to do in writing narrative nonfiction is you've done all of this research, you've found out these amazing things, you want them in your story, but you have to work out what your story is about and how much of it needs to be in this story. How much of your research can you put in there that is necessary for this story at this point? Is there enough room? You don't have much room in a picture book. Is it going to take you down a side pathway? Or does the information that you would really like to put in there, can it go in the illustrations? Is it's one of the things that you can offer to an illustrator as being part of what, you know, of the illustrations they do? And that depends on the project. It can be all things. I really wanted to put in the information in Iceberg about the fact that krill spend the winter tucked into little ice pockets underneath icebergs. And then when the temperature starts to change, they emerge and they mature very quickly, and they start to reproduce in enormous numbers, in the numbers that eventually will feed much of the, directly or indirectly, the animals in the ocean. What I really wanted to put in there is that when the weather cools down again, mature krill reverse age. They become juvenile, because that is the way they live out the overwinter period. It didn't belong in this story. I didn't have room to do that. And you need to make sure that what you do put in needs to be there. Okay, one more exercise. And this is one that I think is a really important one for a number of reasons. The elevator pitch is perfect for when you do actually happen to be caught in an elevator with a publisher who says, well, and so what are you working on? And you can just go, one sentence, a single sentence, you can encapsulate your story. Because if you're only traveling between the second floor and the third floor, you've only got time for a single sentence before that publisher, that editor is off doing something else. And so it's a really good skill to practice for that, you know, for being in an elevator with somebody who may be interested in your story. But it is also a really good way to know if your story is ready to go out. If you can encapsulate your story in a single sentence, then you are probably ready to send it out. So I'd like you to have a go at writing an elevator pitch. You can choose a book that you know well as a practice way to do it, or you can do it with a story that you are beginning. And here's one way to do it, is just interrogate it with those common 5 questions. Who is your story about? In this case, for Dingo, it's about a mother dingo. What is she doing? She is going hunting. When is she going? She's going hunting at dusk. Where is she going? She's going hunting at dusk in the snowy hills. Why is she going hunting? She's trying to find food. So the one sentence elevator pitch for that story is a mother dingo goes hunting at dusk in the snowing hills to find food for her pups. And that encapsulates, it summarizes your story. It shows you and anybody else who's listening what your story is about. So again, I might give you 2 minutes to have a go at putting together an elevator pitch, single sentence. And your time begins now.
And Claire, then it will be time for some questions.
30 seconds. Five. Okay. You may not have finished any of those exercises, but hopefully you can go back to them if you found them useful at all. And now, as directed, I'm going to stop talking. I think you might have noticed by now I can talk underwater. So I'm handing back to Yvonne to manage the questions. Is that how we're going?
Yeah, well, I was hoping for some more questions in the actual chat, but I think people were happy to listen. I did have one quick question from Rhonda, whether your elevator pitch should include an ending.
Sorry, can you say?
Whether your elevator pitch should include an ending.
I think it is safe to share an ending with a publisher or an editor. They're going to want to know that you can wrap up a story, not just that you can begin it, but you can finish it.
Very good. All right. Hands up if you've got a question for Claire. We might have to go that way. Wow, Claire, here I was like, Claire, there's going to be so many questions. We need to stop on time. Oh, Anne has a question. That's good. Phew. Anne, can you unmute yourself first? Oh, they're coming along now, Claire.
Excellent.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Claire, on that screen about elevator pitch, you had 3 points and there was a short 3-letter word on the list and I missed it. Can you recall what it was and what did it mean?
Jenny here, I think it was WIP and I think it means work in progress.
Yes.
Is that right?
Work in progress.
Sorry. I apologise.
Yep, got it. Yep, perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now Fiona would like to know if you ever choose an illustrator yourself.
No. When I write, I don't see what my images look like, and the publisher will look at it and it will suggest a connection to them, and they will normally run it past me and then approach illustrators based on that. So I don't want that control. I don't want to do that because I love the fact that there's more than one brain making this story the best it can be. And if it was just relying on my brain, it would be a much more limited story than it can be if there are multiple people involved in putting it all into the mix.
Does the publisher ever ask you for suggestions?
Yes.
Okay, good. And another question from Marion McGuinness. Hang on, it just changed. How is it best to approach a publisher with this kind of narrative non-fiction book like your Iceberg? And I just wanted to add that, yeah, that was going through my head as well. Do you do all of that research and gather all of that material and then pitch it? Or do you pitch the idea, they'll say, that sounds good, and then do all of that huge amount of research and gather all the information?
Iceberg I completed before I sent it to my agent. I didn't think I would be able to explain what I was trying to do because I didn't know what I wanted to do until I'd done it. And there were many stages, particularly with Iceberg, where I left my office and went out to my husband and said, I cannot do this. This is too hard. This is the one that I have just tried to do something too big and I'm not going to be able to do that. And that happens with every project to some extent, but with this one, I was tearing my hair out. I was sure that it was just not going to happen, but it would not leave me alone. I would go for a walk and I would come back. And so it wasn't until I had got all the way through that and had it the way I wanted to that I submitted it. And I had to change virtually nothing of that text. But for the some of the others, yes, I will pitch an idea. And I will do the research once that idea has been maybe tested with marketing and then I will begin, because yes, there is an enormous amount of work involved in doing the research. With Iceberg, I was comfortable doing that, but if I'm doing a new topic, I would rather have some commitment from a publisher before I spend the next 6 months immersed in that world.
Yes, I can imagine. Great answer. Sherry, did you want to ask your question yourself?
Sure, thanks, Yvonne. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Sherry.
I was wondering how you would approach an elevator pitch for some of your less narrative non-fictions. Do you still start, like, instead of the who, what, when, where, why, do you have a different structure?
With a pure non-fiction, they tend to be, they have tended to be commissioned. And so that wasn't an issue with those. My name is Lizzie Flynn. All I knew is I'd found this convict quilt made by all of these women. And I went to the publisher and said, I've found this quilt. This is what it's about. I want to write a story about it. And although that was a yes, go ahead. But I didn't have, it's not non-fiction in a traditional sense. I think if you were trying to do that, pitching it early on is a really good idea. And yes, of course, then it's not going to, but you need to find the germ. So in that one, the germ was this amazing artifact that was remaining from a time when it's the only quilt that remains from that time, yet they were made aboard many, many ships, and the fabric was used in different ways. So it's that kernel that gets you into the idea that is also going to intrigue a publisher. So in that case, I'd be looking for something that they may not know or may not know much about that will be a hook for them, which is then also a hook into the market.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now Karen would like to know if you know what publishers are seeking any narrative non-fiction at the moment.
Oh, I wish that I was able to do that. That would just make focusing and targeting so easier. Yeah. I think it's a matter of looking in your bookshops if you can, and looking online at publishers' websites. I think the thing that is true is that it is an enormously growing market, and it's a good time to be writing these sorts of stories.
Great. And Rhonda would like to know how you cite your sources in narrative nonfiction. I think that's a great question. I write some narrative nonfiction and I keep everything waiting for the day that somebody's asked me, where did you find this? How do I know this is true? It hasn't happened yet. But what do you do? How does it work with you?
Well, I did actually have an email recently that queried one of the narrative nonfiction books, and I went back and I discovered that it was one of the earlier ones and that my record keeping wasn't as good as it should be. I was able to find a source. I was confident that what I had put in there was accurate, but in order to be able to answer the question, I needed to it took me probably a whole day of tracking down resources in a lockdown Melbourne to try and find the source in order to be able to answer the question. I am very grateful that I improved my processes after that, and I have now in some of my books, on one page, I will have the page number. So I will have the book, and I will have the page number and the chapter number and where I found the book, so that if I need to, so I'm not citing it like you would in an essay, but I have it so that I can refer to it if I need to.
Hope that answers your question, Rhonda. Thank you. Now, Mark, did you want to ask your question? I think you're looking for the button. I've
Hello?
lost you. Yep,
Yep.
we can hear you.
Hi, Claire. I was just wanting to know if you pick a broad topic and you're doing a pitch and say your topic is something big, you know, like the weather or rivers, how do you choose a character and know that it just works?
If it's a narrative nonfiction, you need to have something to drive the narrative. If it's a straight nonfiction, then you won't need it in a character in the same way. So it depends. And if you're doing something like weather, that's a very big topic and perhaps would lend itself more to being a complete nonfiction rather than a narrative nonfiction. But if you did want to use a narrative nonfiction, then, you know, like Iceberg doesn't actually have, the iceberg doesn't speak and you know, is an observer, but they become the main character, as it were, that carries the action from scene to scene the way it would, you know, for a story. Does that?
Yeah, I guess there's no definite character like a boy or a girl or a bird, but the iceberg. No, I get
No,
you.
but, you know, Iceberg has no gender, has no, but it's just something that becomes your character that drives, that keeps the story connected from spread to spread.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Carla would like to know when or how did you know that Haywire was more than a picture book and instead should have been a novel? And how was your approach to writing a novel different than to writing a picture book?
Well, the research part of it, exactly the same. The knowing it wasn't a picture book came after several failed drafts of trying to fit everything that I needed to into that really short form. So when I realised it had to be a novel, I started writing it from so Haywire is told from the perspective of two characters. One is a German boy who is aboard the ship, the De Niro, that comes to Australia, and the other one is a boy who is a local in the town where the De Niro boys arrive. And I started with my German boy and I took him on a trip, and he was always going to meet the Australian boy in the midpoint. But then I discovered that in order to do that, I really needed to know him as well. So that meant that I had to completely rewrite or add a whole half a novel to the front that was looking at Tom's story, my Australian boy's story. One person who commented on my novel in an early draft stage said that I was writing like a picture book writer. So a picture book writer leaves space for illustrations, and that doesn't mean for an the marriage of text and image is not the same thing being told in a different way. It is enrichment of the story using both parts of that story. And I think what this person was saying is that I had left space for an illustrator, but there ain't going to be an illustrator in a novel. So I had to go back and provide more description in a way that in my picture books, I have very little description. So it was a different process. And as I said, 6 years to get it happening, many, many rewrites to get it working.
Great, yes. Julian, did you want to ask your question?
Yep. I hope this is not an impertinent question.
I was interested in the answer.
I just
Now
wondered,
I'm scared.
I just wondered if you have an agent and if that sort of helps you to know what the houses are looking for, or if you directly pitch yourself. And then also, I asked because we heard that Claire Halifax has moved from Scholastic to Walker, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on like she's been saying a lot that she wants to do more of the literary books like she was doing at Omnibus, and I just wondered if you thought it would change Walker's list at all.
Okay, I'll try and do these in order. The first one was about the agent. When I first started having books published, I didn't have an agent because, you know, as anybody who's tried to get an agent knows, that it can be just as difficult. And it just felt like if I was going to put energy into something, I would put it into trying to get the publication rather than trying to get an agent if they were equal things. And also there was a feeling at that time that here in Australia, we had pretty good access to publishers at conferences and in ways like that. That has become more difficult, and the publishing world is smaller. So I didn't have an agent. Then I had an agent, and then I didn't have an agent, and I went for quite some time with no agent. And then in the last couple of years, I have been working with an agent again. So I also work in a bookshop, so I have access to new books all the time. So I do a lot of research there. I love conferences, and particularly conferences for the opportunity just to see what people are looking for. And I don't need an agent for that. It's a bit more difficult in the last couple of years because, of course, we haven't been able to have conferences, and there's a difference. I know that with the CYA conference, Tina works quite hard to replicate that experience of being able to have informal chats, and there's a Victorian conference that does the same sort of thing in the online space. But for me, there is no substitute for the accidental conversations across breakfast, the incidental conversations that happen when you're with people who are doing the same thing, and no matter which side of that world they're in, the casual conversations are the ones that told me the most. Okay, so that's the first part of it. Now, the movement of Claire from Scholastic to Walker, well, she did this one. She accepted that one. So I was aware of her having an interest in a more literary list. And in the last few years at Scholastics, that's been more difficult with shrinking and changing markets and changing philosophy, I guess, to the way to stay relevant in a current market in her current job. Yes, I suspect every publishing house changes with a new publisher. And I've been publishing with Walker since before Lindsay was there, and elements changed from pre-Lindsay, and I have no doubt that they will change in Claire's time with Walker. Obviously, we will have to wait and see exactly what that means, and it's that balance between what the publisher really wants to do and what the publishing house can manage, and their philosophy about staying in the market. And Walker Books now is part of it's connected to Candlewick in the US, who is the parent company, and as well as Walker UK. And so there will be, a conversation, I have no doubt, between the two needs of the publishing house and the publisher. But yes, I suspect there will be some change in their list. But if it's towards literary fiction, bring it on.
Fantastic. And wouldn't it be nice if they could just sort of, all these publishing houses, just share their business plan and let us know what they're looking for, right?
There's always room for dreams.
Yeah. Deborah Tipple would like to know how many projects you work on at once.
Oh, hello, Deborah. I can't see you. I tend to, the first draft of something, I tend to only work on one first draft or one zero draft. However, because things that are accepted move at different rates. Books will come back, or manuscripts will come back with suggestions to rework them in some way. So that sort of editing I can do while I'm also doing this other one, and proof checking and those sorts of things. I can also, once I've got a firm draft, then I can work on something else at the same time. But to try and keep the ideas in the right manuscript, I'm working on something at the moment that is set in a tropical environment, and you want to be careful that you're not reflecting animals that live in a icy environment accidentally, or even sensibilities or daylight hours and things. And so I try and keep them separate until I've got a really good handle on what the story's about. So several, but generally only one first draft.
All right, I've got a question. What is your poetry background? Because your beautiful lyrical language, it's also poetic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before I started writing for children, I wrote adult poetry, and I had quite a lot of adult poetry published. But when I decided to write for children, I went back and did a poetry subject as part of the professional writing and editing subject. So that's a whole year subject on poetry. And my purpose in doing that was to further hone my poetic language for picture books. And so quite consciously, I was trying to find better ways to say what I wanted to say. And so that's my background as far as that goes.
Beautiful. Has anybody got another question? I think we have time for one last question. Yes, Anne. You'll have to get off mute.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. My question is, how much, if you're working with an illustrator, how much of your research do you share? Do you just say, here is this, or do you expect the illustrator to do their own research, which seems mammoth when you have done so much? Thank you.
It's a really good question. For
Iceberg.
Well, Iceberg, I just said, I think Jess was quite overwhelmed by the amount of the number of references to different things. So I did just holus bolus say, this is my research, do with it what you will. And that's what she did. Other times, so for example, with the nature storybooks, I just do a general thing. So I would say, I have imagined this by a river in, a wooded river. For Dingo, I intentionally set this story in the snow. So I just said, this is set in the mountains. Koala, I was much more open. Koalas, choose their environments for very specific reasons. So when Julie was doing it, yes, we had conversations about it, but basically, I know that koalas, and she knew that koalas only occupy a certain number of trees, which allowed her to make
illustrate.
Emu, I wanted to set this one in open scrubland, mainly as a point of difference to the first one, which is set in the outback with the red soil outback. And I try with each one of them to set them in a different environment, just to offer a different environment to the reader. But that's the only thing I would say is this is where I have imagined this story. And then it's open then for the illustrator to show it in the way they want to. And I want them to do that. I don't want to be prescribing how it's done.
I think that's fantastic that you give the other creator of the book room to bring their own creative, their creative input into the story, because that can be quite difficult, can't it?
Okay,
All right,
thank you.
unfortunately, that is all that we
Yeah.
have time for. It was absolutely wonderful to hear you speak. I think you definitely scratched my itch when it came to narrative nonfiction. I see a lot of happy faces. Let's give Claire a big wave, a big right-lings thank you. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Best of luck with all of your writing and illustrating.
Thank